We will start with 41.
Correct. Yes.
Okay. Meena Nirulaji said she has to go for some eye testing.
Okay.
Anyway, the recording will be available. Now, Arjuna says to Sri Krishna, and I am going to read 41, 42, 43, 44.
Right.
Okay. सखेति मत्वा प्रसभं यदुक्तं हे कृष्ण हे यादव हे सखेति अजानता महिमानं तवेदं मया प्रमादात् प्रणयेन वापि यच्चावहासार्थम् असत्कृतोऽसि विहारशय्यासन भोजनेषु एकोऽथवाप्यच्युत तत्समक्षं तत्क्षामये त्वामहम् अप्रमेयम् पितासि लोकस्य चराचरस्य त्वमस्य पूज्यश्च गुरुर्गरीयान् न त्वत्समो समोऽस्त्यभ्यधिकः कुतोऽन्यो लोकत्रयेऽप्यप्रतिमप्रभाव तस्मात् प्रणम्य प्रणिधाय कायं प्रसादये त्वामहमीश्वरम् ईड्यम् पितेव पुत्रस्य सखेव सख्युः प्रियः प्रियायाः अर्हसि देव सोढुम्. Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to read the translation first. 41. Whatsoever I have spoken to thee in rash vehemence, thinking of thee only as my human friend and companion, O Krishna, O Yadava, O comrade, not knowing this, thy greatness is negligent error or in love. 42. And whatsoever disrespect was shown by me to thee in jest, on the couch, and the seat, and in the banquet, alone or in another's presence, O Achyutya, Shri Krishna, for that I pray forgiveness from thee, O immeasurable. 43. Thou art the Father of all this world of the moving and unmoving. Thou art one to be worshipped and the most solemn object of veneration. None is equal to thee. How then another greater in all the three worlds, O incomparable in might? 44. Therefore I bow down before thee and prostrate my body, and I demand grace of thee, the adorable Lord, as a father to his son, as a friend to his friend, as a lover to his beloved. O shouldst thou, O Godhead, bear with me. The commentary. And this is from page 392 of the Essays from the Gita, Essays on the Gita. The infinite presence in its unmitigated splendor would be too overwhelming for the separate littleness of the limited individual and natural man. A link is needed by which we can see this universal Godhead in his own individual and natural being, close to him, not only omnipotently there to govern all he is by universal and immeasurable power, but humanly figured to support and raise him to unity by an intimate individual relation. The adoration by which the finite creature bows down before the infinite receives all its sweetness and draws near to a closest truth of companionship and oneness when it deepens into the more intimate adoration which lives in the sense of the fatherhood of God, the friendhood of God, the attracting love between the divine spirit and our human soul and nature. KKG, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. If you remember, in another context, I have mentioned that all description, all praise, or extolling is an expression which is preceded by experience. Without experience, if one is, expressing himself in so many words, that expression has no meaning or no understanding or no depth in it, and somewhere it will sound very hollow. That is the reason why repeatedly it is said that don't hold on to words. The words expressed by somebody are actually a consequence of his or her experience, which is not the case with us. We are only hearing the words and not having the relevant experience which the person who has expressed has had. So there is bound to be a dichotomy, and there is bound to be a misunderstanding of the words. So words themselves have no relevance, especially in the domain where the mind does not operate. Whatever expression is given is actually a case of stepping down the intensity of it and descriptive in nature. This is the reason why Jiddu Krishnamurti repeatedly said that the description is not the described. Description is not the described at all. If you hold on to the description, one will get lost. So our whole effort should be to see if we are capable of at least sensing in some manner, or touching at least partially the experience which the other person had, which is not actually, I should say, the right thing by itself, because it's not so easy to get that experience just like that. It's not so easy to experience what somebody else has experienced. But at least the words expressed should convey a deeper meaning to us. Just a minute. So you see, holding on to words can be very, very misleading. Whether it is the scripture or the words of the Guru, they only provide you with some basic knowledge and, in case of serious students, a direction. That is the reason why Adi Shankara makes a distinction between Jnana and Vijnana. He says Jnana is Guru Vakya and Shruti Vakya. It is the knowledge imparted to you, which is embodied in the scripture or in the words of the Guru. How can they be real? How can they actually represent the truth in any manner whatsoever? That is one point. So therefore, you have to move towards experiencing. That experiencing would bring about the transformation one is looking for, or one is actually trying to identify oneself with. And out of that experience, if some expression comes, then it will be true to you. It will ring true to you. And if somebody is resonating at the same frequency, then he will also be able to appreciate the truth of it. That is why the statements of great sages and saints, which may be very simple and may be in very ordinary language, would have a greater impact than the same words being repeated by somebody else who never had any experience of that divinity. This point has to be borne in very clearly in mind. Now, why I am saying this as a preamble to our study of today's verses is, Arjuna had that cosmic vision, that overwhelming experience, which is making him say all these things. He is now able to see that what a fool I was, what a state of ignorance I was in. I thought that Sri Krishna is like any other human friend or companion or comrade or relative. I never knew about his divinity, and therefore, very casually and sometimes in a rash manner or jocularly, in a joking manner, I have called you, O comrade, or I have called you, O Krishna, or O Yadava. I have addressed you like one addresses an ordinary person. Now he is able to see that what he has done is actually a sacrilege, because he never knew about this omnipresence, the true nature of Sri Krishna. Therefore, he says, I have done this out of negligence or out of my affection for you. Pramadat pranayena vapi. Pramada is out of error, out of negligence, out of my own ignorance, or out of affection for you. Because see, they have grown together, they are related through marriage, and they are otherwise known to each other. So therefore, there is always this possibility of becoming too familiar. There is a saying in English that familiarity breeds contempt. The more familiar you are with a person, the more casual you become, or sometimes you become contemptuous. More so because a person with whom you are familiar, somehow our minds are unfortunately trained in a negative manner to see only the negative aspects. We don't see the best aspects or good aspects or aspects worthy of emulation in our own parents, in our own spouse, in our own close friend. We don't see much of these best qualities. We only see their negative qualities or casual attitude or their ordinary, behavior. That impresses more on our mind. And therefore, we are in such a situation. The same thing happened with Arjuna also. He has taken Krishna for granted. Like, he is my friend, he is a relative to me, and that too, there is this expression, you see, he is repenting by addressing him by his community name, Yadava. See, if you take it in those days, the hierarchy was very clear. The Kshatriyas were considered to be above the Yadavas. So there might have been some, attitude of condescending attitude on the part of Arjuna in addressing Sri Krishna as Yadava, which is true. See, not that it is a derogatory, but there may appear to be a condescending attitude by addressing him as such. You see all these things, and therefore he says, whatsoever disrespect I have shown to you, either in a sporting, jocular manner, either while seated beside you or having food together or sleeping on the same couch, whatever it may be, I might have shown disrespect to you, either when we were alone or when there was company, when others were also present. Therefore, he says, I pray forgiveness from thee, O immeasurable. Aprameya. Aprameyam means immeasurable. He has realized that quality of immeasurability in Sri Krishna in the cosmic vision, which he has seen. Therefore, very appropriately, he calls him, O immeasurable. So therefore, and he is also the infallible. Achyuta means infallible. That which can never fall down, that which can never descend actually. So, I am seeking your forgiveness. This is a genuine expression on the part of Arjuna, and he says, now I realize that thou art the father of all the world, of all that is moving and unmoving. And you are the only one worthy of worship and veneration. Nobody is your equal. Natvat samo asti abhyadika kutonyaha. There is nobody your equal also. Where is the question of somebody being greater than you? So in all the three worlds, there is none who is even your equal. Forget about somebody being greater than you. Because you are apratima prabhava. You are incomparable in your might, in your ability, in your very being, your capability. You are somebody who is incomparable, apratima. Therefore, I bow down to thee. I prostrate before you with my entire body. That's called Sashtanga Namaskara. Sashtanga means all the 8 limbs of our body touching the ground. That means falling at the feet of somebody, whereby your hands, your head, your chest, your stomach, your thighs, your knees, your feet, all the 8 organs touching the ground. And you are the Isha. You are the adorable one. Eid. Eid is a very beautiful dhatu, a root, verbal root in the Sanskrit language. Eid means to worship, to adore, to show great reverence and offer prayers. Why this is so important is the very first mantra of the Rigveda starts with this Agnimile Purohitam. Ide Agnim Ide. I worship the Agni. I offer my reverence to Agni. That's the reason why fire becomes the most important element for life on earth. You know, in the life of a human being, 16 karmas are assigned, 16 aspects of one's own life, starting from conception to death, which are celebrated. I am deliberately using the term celebration even for death. Death is also a part of the same celebratory process. These are called the Shodasha karmas, starting from the conception to death. In all these 16 ceremonies that are performed, Agni is the most important element. Without Agni, there cannot be any ceremony as per the Vedic injunction. So all these ceremonies are performed in the presence of the Agnihotra. And in the very first mantra of the Rigveda, the term Agnimile Purohitam is mentioned. Ide, I remembered that root verb, id, to worship, to adore. Here also he uses Tvam Aham Isham Idyam. How does he seek his grace and worship the adorable Lord? He says, Piteva Putrasya, as a father to his son, Sakheva Sakshuhu, as a friend to his friend, Priyah Priyayaha, as a lover to his beloved, Arhasi Deva Sodhum. I demand of you, and I think I am eligible to be taken that way, and you have to bear with me. Sodhum means to take the burden or bear with me. So you are, I recognize you thus. I prostrate before you, and I consider you as that adorable Lord, and therefore you have to bear with me, just as a father bears with his son, a friend bears with another friend, and as a lover bears everything that of his beloved. So even in all these three relationships, we tend to ignore anything which is negative, or which may be a small, error of or a small quirk of his own character, or any fault in him, in a friend or in a beloved or in the son. We pardon it or we overlook it. So Arjuna also says, similarly, you kindly overlook all my faults and all the manner in which I have treated you. Now I recognize who you are truly. Now I recognize who you are truly. So that is the idea that is presented here. And very interestingly, Sri Aurobindo says, why has Arjuna expressed himself in this vein? It is because the infinite presence in its unmitigated splendor would be too overwhelming for the separate littleness of the limited individual and natural man. Arjuna was totally overwhelmed, taken over He couldn't actually withstand it. So a link is needed by which he can see the universal Godhead in his own individual and natural being, close to him, not only omnipotently, there to govern all he is by universal and immeasurable power, but humanly figured to support and raise him to unity by an intimate individual relation. If there were to be no form of God in any manner whatsoever, if everything were to be considered totally abstract, we can't really connect from our present level of consciousness, isn't it? So some symbol or the other is required. Even those religions which do not believe in any idol worship or anything, if not an idol, they have a symbol, they have a book, they have a prophet, they have a shrine, they have a holy place, isn't it? When God is present everywhere, why do you require a symbol also? Because otherwise the mind cannot hold it. Like that statement which is attributed to Swami Vivekananda, when somebody asked, when God is all present everywhere, why do you require a temple? Then he said the same thing. He said, you agree that air is everywhere? Yes, air is everywhere. Air is spread all over. Then why do you require a fan? Why do you require a fan? Because you want that air to be in a concentrated form available to you. It should be available to you in a concentrated form. So a temple is a source of concentrated energy, divine energy. Any holy place. Any holy place is a source of great energy. So if not an idol, you would require some symbol or the other. The idol is also a symbol. A photograph, a picture is also a symbol. A word is a symbol. So human beings at their present level of consciousness cannot do without these symbols. These symbols, images, allegories, stories, all these are a part of the all these are a part of the same mechanism, because otherwise the mind cannot hold it, mind cannot grasp it. Okay. Just hold on, please. So this is what very beautifully is explained by Sri Aurobindo. He says that a link is needed by which he can see this universal Godhead in his own individual and natural being close to him. Not only omnipotently there to govern all, he is by universal and immeasurable power, but humanly figured to support and raise him to unity by an intimate individual relationship. The adoration by which the finite creature bows down before the infinite receives all its sweetness and draws near to a closest truth of companionship and oneness, which is when it deepens into the more intimate adoration, which lives in the sense of the fatherhood of God, the friendhood of God, the attracting love between the divine spirit and our human soul and nature. So it is necessary to have this link, to have this relationship. And that becomes closer the greater the experience you have of that person. The greater your experience, the more deep you are connected to that individual who is an embodiment of that divinity. You also move closer to him and things are revealed to you. Things are revealed to you. Okay? So, this is the message that is conveyed to us through this expression of Arjuna in these 4 verses which we have read. I see some chat here. Yeah, the link explains the need for avatars. Yeah, that is true, Binaji, because we have to, otherwise it becomes difficult. Otherwise it becomes difficult for us to know. In fact, every saint, every sage, every person who in some form manifests their divinity is a source of great energy. They may not claim any divinity, but that itself is an indication. Their presence, their attitude, their behavior, their words, which carry deep impact.
Yeah.
So that is so see, in evolution, that is why generally in the theosophical literature, the masters are called as the elder brethren. They are elder brethren in the sense they have come before us and evolved before us and have moved on. And who have come out of this compulsive cycle of birth and death. That's what a Mahatma or a master symbolizes. He is not actually a person. He is a personality with a consciousness of that divinity manifesting, and they are called as elder brethren. Like in the same school, there is a child in the kindergarten, and there is a grown-up person in the 12th standard or intermediate, isn't it? So it is the same thing.
Yeah.
So you have gradations of persons all through. That gradation is there. So it is necessary, it's a necessary part of the evolutionary scheme where one is guided in a particular direction for greater and greater evolution from the point of view of our own consciousness. So that is the importance of this. Nobody can deny it. Yeah, Binaji.
On page 392, he says it very beautifully. He says the transcendence and cosmic aspect have to be seen, for without that seeing, the limitations of humanity cannot be exceeded.
Can you just hold on for a minute?
Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, there was some.
You want me to read that again?
Yeah, please. Sorry.
Okay. So he says it very beautifully, page 392. The transcendence and cosmic aspect have to be seen, for without that seeing, the limitations of humanity cannot be exceeded.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is very, very beautifully said. You say in the sense, unless you know this is there, you even mentally you can't cross over. You can't even you will be stuck in your limitations.
And you don't know where evolution will take you. You know, I mean, here is something that.
So these visions in different forms are required to inspire human beings to aspire to greater things. In fact, you remember in some context I was mentioning that up to 1950s, it was thought that nobody can break the barrier of running 100 meters in 10 seconds. So when all these experts and scientists and doctors and all, when they started saying that, it became a mental barrier. But somebody broke that record, and later on, several people have broken that record. So we create our own mental barriers through our own limitations, unless somebody points out to something which is beyond the mind. That is the transcendence and the cosmic vision which he is talking about. Yeah, very beautifully put by Sri Aurobindo. Any further discussion before we proceed to the next two verses? Anybody would like to raise some point so that we can discuss, or otherwise we can go to the next two verses which are also in the same this thing. Shall we go to the next two verses then? Shall I read the next two verses, 45 and 46? Yeah. अदृष्टपूर्वम् उषितोऽस्मि दृष्ट्वा भयेन च प्रव्यथितं मनो मे तदेव मे दर्शय देव रूपं प्रसीद देवेश जगन्निवास किरीटिनं गदिनं चक्रहस्तमिच्छामि त्वां द्रष्टुमहं तथैव तेनैव रूपेण चतुर्भुजेन सहस्रबाहो भव विश्वमूर्ते.
Okay, the translation of these two, 45. I have seen what never was seen before, and I rejoice. But my mind is troubled with fear. O Godhead, show me that other form of thine. Turn thy heart to grace, O thou Lord of the gods, O thou abode of the universe. 46. I would see thee, even as before, crowned and with thy mace and discus. Assume thy four-armed shape, O thousand-armed, O form universal. The commentary, the form of the transcendent and universal being is to the strength of the liberated spirit a thing mighty, encouraging, and fortifying, a source of power and equalizing, sublimating, all justifying vision. But to the normal man, it is overwhelming, appalling, incommunicable. The truth that reassures, even when known, is grasped with difficulty behind the formidable and mighty aspect of all destructive time and an incalculable will and a vast, immeasurable, inextricable working. But there is too the gracious mediating form of divine Narayana, the God who is so close to man and in man, the charioteer of the battle and the journey, with his four arms of helpful power, a humanized symbol of Godhead, not this million-armed universality.
Yeah. Now, personally, I feel that this verse number 46 is a kind of interpolation. Though it is accepted as a part of the 700 verses which have been finalized by Adi Shankara, see, nowhere in the Mahabharata is Sri Krishna depicted as though he is having four arms. These four arms, one holding the mace, one holding the chakra, one holding the shankha and the padma. This is an imaginary form which is created of Vishnumurti, which is symbolic of several things. We need not go into the symbolism of that Vishnu, because that has a beautiful significance of its own. That there are four arms, each one holding the shankha and chakra in two arms. The chakra in the right arm, right hand, and the shankha in the left, and a mace in one hand and a sometimes with an arrow or with a Padma, that's a lotus in one hand. This symbolism is that of Vishnu, that is imaginary in one way, or more, as I said, more symbolic, representing several things. Okay. But Arjuna asking him to show his normal form with these four hands is, something which militates with our own reasoning. Where is Krishna with four arms? He was like any other human being. He was having a human body, and he has given up his body also. The body died also. The body was subject to death also. So, but one thing he is mentioning in 45, that the cosmic vision and that Vishwarupa you have shown me is something which nobody else has seen till now. Is what is his statement? Adruštapurvam rushitosmi društva bhayena cha pravyathitam mano. And I have seen that with a great fear in me, and also my mind is troubled. Pravyathitam manaha is disturbed, and therefore please resume your ordinary form with which I am familiar. Now I recognize thee as a person who is the Lord of all the gods, Devesha, and also you are the abode of the universe, Jagannivasa. I recognize you thus as the Lord of all the gods, and also somebody who is pervading the whole of the universe. Please resume your ordinary form, because he is unable to withstand it. As I said, it's more a case of withstanding than understanding. One should be able to withstand that because it was given to him artificially. The Divya Chakshu or Jnana Chakshu or the divine vision was provided to him artificially and temporarily. And therefore, he is pleading that you please restore your ordinary form, and at the same time saying, Kiritinam Gadinam Chakrahastam Ichhami Tvam Drashtumaham Tathaiva Tenaiva Rupena Chaturbhujena. This is something which, at least to my mind, is illogical. When did Sri Krishna appear with four arms in the ordinary course of things to Arjuna? There is no reference, at least to my knowledge. I stand corrected if there is some reference somewhere where he is shown as though having four hands. But it was like, you see, he was born, it was a natural birth, and it was a natural human form, and he continued in that, and he had a natural death and decay of the body also. This is an interpolation, at least to my mind, where Sri Krishna is shown to be an avatar of Vishnu. See, there is a great symbolism in the Vishnu Avatara. I'll not go much into it, but only mention one small thing. You see, there are temples consecrated to Vishnu in which these four arms, they have all interchanged, adornments and weapons. Like in one form, he is holding the mace in the right hand. In some other context, he is holding it in the left hand. In one context, the chakra is in the right hand and the shankha is in the left, but it is interchanged. Very interestingly, long back, I was told that this symbology actually represents the 24 forms or 24 names of Keshava. They are called as Keshava Namas. Normally, we recite these things. We say Keshava Swaha, Narayana Swaha, Madhava Swaha, Govinda, Vishnu, Madhusudana, Trivikrama, Vamana. These 24 names are there. Now, where has this 24 come about? This 24 is that the forms where all these four arms are shown to be adorning different weapons and different ornaments. Like Shankha and Chakra get reversed. sometimes. I think that is one case in Bhadrachalam. The form of Sri Rama, it is interchanged. Now this 24 has come about, which in mathematical terms is what we call as factorial 4. Factorial 4 is 4 into 3 into 2 into 1. 4 into 3 is 12, 12 into 2 is 24, 24 into 1 is 24. So that's called as factorial 4. So it's a mathematical symbolism is there in the form of Sri Mahavishnu, who is depicted to have 4 arms. And as I said, different, sometimes, sometimes in some forms it is shown that he is having a bow and an arrow. A bow in the left hand and an arrow in the right hand. The Shankha chakras are interchanged. All the 4, the maximum number of combinations you can make out of any 4, anything represented by 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 is 24. 4 into 3 into 2 into 1. That's what is called in mathematical terms as factorial 4. So there is a greater symbology behind these images and what they represent. But this particular shloka saying that you are with 4 arms doesn't fit in here very well. Doesn't fit in here very well. I think Aurobindo also explains in his own terms as to how the various aspects represent that he is shown to be in that this thing of 4 arms. But what is of importance in the commentary according to Sri Aurobindo is the form of the transcendent and universal being is to the strength of the liberated spirit a thing mighty. A person who is liberated, for him, it will be something encouraging and fortifying. A source of power and equalizing, sublimating, all justifying vision. But what happens if it is a case of a normal man? Then he says, but to the normal man, it is an overwhelming, appalling, incommunicable. The truth that reassures even when known is grasped with difficulty. That is grasped with difficulty. Even if it is reassuring and even if it is made known to him, it is not so easy to grasp or know it because of the formidable nature of it, and you see the all-destructive time and the incalculable will operating through that. So he explains why Arjuna has asked him to come back to his normal vision and show him his normal vision. Because that normal vision is what he can withstand. He cannot go into, he cannot actually see the immensity of it because he is unable to perceive that might because of being a normal, ordinary man. Okay, but there is too the gracious in a mediating form of a divine Narayana, the God who is so close to man and in man. Very beautifully, Sri Aurobindo tries to explain and say that it is not Sri Krishna here who is visualized by Arjuna, but Narayana. So he has a visualization of Narayana when he is referring to 4 arms and the ornaments or decorations or the mace and the discus and other things which he is talking about. Okay, so the charioteer of the battle and the journey with his 4 arms of helpful power, a humanized symbol of Godhead, not this million-armed universality. In the Vishwarupa, he has seen him with 1,000 hands. So he says those 1,000 hands are too terrible for me to withstand. So you please come back to the form of Narayana, who is normally visualized with the 4 arms. Okay?
Krishnapatiji, what is so scary or destructive about Vishnu that he needs to imagine him as Narayana. Narayana, he talks about as a friendly Godhead.
Yeah, friendly God only. Narayana is with the forearms.
So, but Vishnu is also a very peaceful.
No, Vishnu and Narayana are one and the same only. Narayana and Vishnu is not differentiated.
All right, okay.
He say Keshava, Narayana, Madhava, Govinda. All these are synonyms. The 24 names are symbolic. In fact, in that you get the name of Sankarshana and others also. Balarama is called as Sankarshana.
Okay.
Sankarshana, the etymological meaning of that word, it is attributed to Sri Krishna also.
Okay.
The name is attributed to Sri Krishna also, but Balarama is generally known as Sankarshana. He was so huge while in the womb that they had to perform a C-section and pull him out of the womb. So you can say that during the days of the Mahabharata, they knew about C-section also. So in fact, you should not call it as a Caesarian, but you should call him as Balaramian section. Because Balarama was prior to, it is said of Julius Caesar that it was not a normal delivery, but he had to be, they had to open and remove him, and that's how the name C-section has come. But in our tradition, Balarama, the Sankarshana, the word itself means one who is pulled out of the womb. The literal meaning of that word is that. So Sankarshana, Vasudeva, all these names are there in the 24 Chaturvimshati Nama. So
okay.
24 Nama.
Thank
so
you.
Narayana is no different from Vishnu. That is what he is saying. You come back and appear like Narayana or Vishnu is also again a symbol which is more familiar to Arjuna than the cosmic form. That's what it is. That is the thing. But anyway, but my own personal opinion I have expressed seems to be a kind of an interpolation in the Bhagavad Gita added might be later on sometime. But before Adi Shankara finalized it as 700. In fact, I told you, the Kashmir rendition of the Bhagavad Gita goes up to 745 verses. The edition of Annie Besant and Bhagwan Das gives about 702 or 703 verses there. They very clearly mentioned that this verse is there in the Kashmir edition of the Bhagavad Gita and so on and so forth. But as I said, this unnecessary discussion and dispute on the number has been once for all settled by Adi Shankara, and later on everybody uniformly followed only that 700 verses of Bhagavad Gita. Yes, sir. Anything to discuss? Umesh ji? Umesh Dhagat ji?
I wanted to refer to what we spoke last week. So
can you speak loudly, slightly?
Yes, please. I wanted to refer to the points that we spoke last week.
Yeah.
You remember those 2 points that I thought I would like to think about or contemplate?
Yeah, can you repeat them?
Yes, one was the creation and creator. The creator is in creation.
Yes.
And the second part was the knower and knowable.
Yeah. Yeah, I think we discussed this sometime long back in the School of Ancient. See, there is what is called as the knower, the known, the knowable, and the unknown.
Okay.
We are talking about it from a mental consciousness level, where you can distinguish these 4 aspects. See, anything which is objective and outside one's own self is what is generally called as the known, or what is to be known. The known or to be known. Gneyam, the term that is used is gneyam, that which is to be known. Okay? That which is to be known is within the domain of what is knowable. Okay? So it is within that means anybody who makes an effort can know it. See, for example, there are two aspects to it. Two things are, one thing is very objective things. There are not much of effort is required to know that this is a glass and this is a mobile phone, and these things are objects outside oneself, and they are, one can know them without much difficulty. Now, if somebody were to talk about something which is deeper deeper in the sense, suppose I were to talk about a subject like physics or mathematics, or any subject for that matter, biology or chemistry or medicine or whatever you may talk about. Now, that is knowable.
Yeah.
That means if you make an effort, you can know about it, right? So if you don't make an effort, you can't know it. Okay? So known, that which can be easily known, that which is generally known, which is objective in nature, and that which is knowable through sense organs, including the mind. These are two subjects, the two aspects which are quite distinct from each other. But when I mention physics or chemistry or any subject matter or any skill, if you are talking about driving or if you are talking about cooking, they are also knowable. That means one can make an effort and know them, right? So where the mental faculty is involved, and along with the mental faculty, your senses are also involved in it, and therefore that is the knowable part of it. So a knower is there, and there is something to be known, and something knowable are always there within the domain of the mental consciousness. Now, anything beyond the mental consciousness relates to the unknown. Relates to the unknown in the sense, these faculties totally fail if you are trying to know that. These faculties are totally futile, useless. They are of no value when you are talking about something beyond the experience, knowledge, memory framework of the mind. Okay? And I'll tell you some interesting thing about it. One thing is, you have a tremendous feeling of joy or sorrow, right? This is also within the common experience of all human beings, right? But can the mind really register the intensity of that experience which you have had?
No.
I'm trying, do you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
What I'm trying to say is, at this moment, I am experiencing, say, a great amount of grief or sorrow or some kind of an agony. That experience is something which is unrelated to the normal mental consciousness of the human being, right? And what happens to that experience? It fades away, right? It fades away. After 1 hour, you don't feel the same intensity. After 2 days, the intensity would have considerably reduced. After a week or 10 days or a month, it remains only as a memory. And after maybe 2 years, you completely forget about it also. This experience of great joy or ecstasy or sorrow or grief, from the mental framework point of view, is also an alien experience which has come into it. It is an alien experience which has disturbed the mind. And the mind, very superficially and for its own survival, records as a memory. Just keeps it recorded so that it is not subjected to the same thing if it is filled with pain or grief, and would want it to be repeated if it is something pleasurable. So this also is a an unknown dimension impinging upon the mind, whereby that experience is recorded in its own form as far as the mind is concerned. But kindly understand that the experience of the mind, the experience itself is something which is totally different and which is incomprehensible to the mind. The impact of it is felt by the mind, but the experience per se, that is why what happens in medical terms is amnesia is there. If you are suddenly exposed to some great shock, what happens? They have found that people lose their memory. It doesn't record at all. They forget that such an event has happened. Somebody has died suddenly, and it was such a great impact for the one who is close to that person, like his wife or husband or somebody, that he goes into a shock, and the fact that the person has died and on account of it, the tremendous shock was there for the mind is lost, is completely erased from the memory. Right? Why does it happen? Because the mind wants to protect itself, because it could not take that kind of shock, it preferred to simply throw it out and erase it from memory. Right? This is what it is meant by unable to withstand it. So I am trying to make a distinction between the experience of the unknown, which has an impact on the mind. So technically, consciousness is capable of coming into contact with the unknown. Unknown from the mental perspective only. When I say unknown, it doesn't mean totally unknown. Unknown from the point of view of the mind. So therefore, we have this aspect of the unknown remaining as unknown as far as the mind is concerned. It comes into one's own conscious experience in the absence of the mind. This has been repeatedly stated by everybody. You take any religion, any philosophy, any spiritual domain, any spiritual experience when they have talked about, they said it is something beyond the mind. But then, though it is something beyond the mind, it leaves an impression on the mind, just like our great sorrow or great ecstasy. That experience of tremendous sorrow in one moment of one's life leaves an impression on the mind. Similarly, something beyond the mind in the domain of what is generally referred to as the spirit, that experience is also something which is a step down, and an impression of that is carried on the mind. That remains the unknown.
Here, my point which I was contemplating was for context with the previous verses which we did last class, that it says that the Lord Krishna remains knower and knowable, whereas the impression was that that supreme force remains unknowable.
No. The point is, he is the only knower and the only thing to be known. That is the meaning of that verse.
To be known.
The only thing to be known and the only knower. You and I are also, inside us is Sri Krishna. The principle operating in us, the Atman.
Yes.
Is Sri Krishna.
Yes. Correct. Therefore, he is the knower.
So the knower is not Umeshji or Beenaji or somebody else.
Right.
The knower and the knowable and the known are all one and the same. That's what in the verse he says, you are the knower and you are the what is to be known. You are both. And there is nothing beyond you. That is the idea that is conveyed in the verse.
But that means it is not unknowable.
It is not unknowable in the sense, it is not knowable in the ordinary course of things as it is understood by the mind. That's what it is. See, these terms are, unfortunately, because we don't have any other means, we are using words.
Yeah.
In the beginning itself, I told you, the description can never be the described.
I agree.
What is being conveyed is that his consciousness pervades everything. And there is nothing to be known beyond him. Having known which, there is nothing else to be known.
Yeah, so what I thought in last 1 week is that it is not really unknowable, because in the Bhagavad Gita, he himself says that one among millions knows him or comes to him, which means there is one among million who could know him.
No. That is only figuratively again. That is only figuratively they are saying that millions may aspire to know me, but he who truly knows me is a very, very rare person. That is the idea.
Which means
Millions
it is. Which means he
yes,
himself.
Sir, if it were not something to be experienced or realized, all this whole creation would be a futile exercise. What for is this whole creation? What for is it? It becomes purposeless and meaningless, isn't it?
Yes, yes.
That is what brings meaning to this whole thing.
Correct, correct.
Otherwise, it appears to be totally random and baseless.
So that comes to the second point. Till such time that one among million who knows him, the creator is different than the creation. Until then, for all of us at this level, creation is equal to creator, which means you see creator into creation.
But the false can never be true, no. If you are in that false mindset till then or later on or before that, that has no relevance. As long as you are having the false notion that the creator is different from the creation, it's a false notion only. You are holding on to something which is not real.
But in one context, you mentioned that only those who are awakened would know that Jagat is Mithya and only Brahman is Satya. Until then.
So until then they are under delusion.
Correct. At this point of time, we are in delusion.
Yeah, that's all. Until you know it, you continue to be in delusion only. All of us are in that state only.
Yes.
That's what I mean.
Yeah. So
you understand the point?
Yes, I got it. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Right. Any other point, sir? It's already 12:15, 12:14. Any other point to be mentioned, to be discussed? I hope I'm making some sense to the participants. Or is it that you are politely bearing with me? I hope I'm making some real sense in the discussion. Please don't simply accept me as it is if it doesn't make sense to you.
Sarji, the discussion with Krishna and Arjuna, even if you are in the place of Arjuna, we would have done exactly the same thing, right?
Yes, they were much worse. It would have been worse, and that's why it did not reveal to us. In that battle, we might be some foot soldiers somewhere in some army. We might have all been there. That's why Sri Krishna says, no, All of you were there earlier also, all of you are there now also, in future also, all of you are going to be there. You know,
But I
you don't
believe
know
that-
your background, but I know my background.
And you are only eligible to be revealed and nobody else. I have not given to anybody else.
Yeah. So in that context also, he said, amongst all the people, you are the best available, not the really best. But amongst the people available, you are the only one. That means I have limited choice. Sri Krishna also said I had limited choice, and therefore I am selecting you to Arjuna. For my purpose, he says, for my purpose, I am selecting you. Okay, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.